is humanism versus exploitation. In socialism, humanism is the ingredient that's chosen and exploitation thrown away. In African culture, traditional African culture, humanism is the ingredient chosen and exploitation dispensed with. So we treat other people with respect within our culture. If somebody else comes to our house and we have 2 grains of rice, we give them 1. If they come to our home and we have 1 grain of rice, we give it to them and go without. This is the African way. This is, you are so important that I will give you my last grain of rice. So Africa and socialism have the same in common at the ideological level. They dash where? Exploitation. Then we come to the political level. Now, when we are talking about the political level, to cut through the wall, what we're talking about is violence. Does the society operate peacefully on the one hand, or does it operate violently on the other? Is it a society where people care for each other, or is it a society where people kill each other? Now, based on the works of some of our greats, some of the greats of African revolutionary history, I've devised something which I call the Four Dialectic tool. It's based on the work of the great Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. He wrote a book called Conscientism, and that informs the Four Dialectic analytical tool. It's based on the work of the great Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar Cabral's book, Return to the Source, helps to inform the Four Dialectic tool. It's also based on the work of another of our greats, Ahmed Sékou Touré. Ahmed Sékou Touré, who wrote the book Revolution, Culture, and Pan Afrikanism. This too informs the Four Dialectic tool. And much of what I've been speaking about up till now has been based on, in fact, it's entirely based on the work of these 3 giants of Pan-Africanism. So let's move forward. So what the Four Dialectic tool does is it looks at any society at 4 levels. It looks at the society at the philosophical level, at the ideological level, at the political level, and at the economic level. And it defines these as the higher level ingredients. We're talking about the higher level ingredients of any society. All societies must have those 4 ingredients. It's impossible to have a society without them. That's each and every one of them. And those ingredients can be analyzed in relation to what I'm going to call the dialectic. Now, I haven't got time to necessarily explain dialectics in detail. That's a whole subject in itself. But for simplicity, what I'm going to mean by dialectics here is opposites and their relations. So there are particular opposites inside of each of those categories. So at the philosophical level, you have materialism versus idealism. Inside your society, you must be, your society must be run on the basis that it's either materialist or it's idealist. You haven't got a choice. There are no other options. It's one of those two or some permutation of them. In the socialist society, it is materialist. In African society, traditional African society, it is materialist. So immediately, socialism and Africa start philosophically from the same point. Then we move to ideology. And the dialectic here, I'll stick to the main dialectic, is humanism versus exploitation. In socialism, humanism is the ingredient that's chosen and exploitation thrown away. In African culture, traditional African culture, humanism is the ingredient chosen and exploitation dispensed with. So we treat other people with respect within our culture. If somebody else comes to our house and we have 2 grains of rice, we give them 1. If they come to our home and we have 1 grain of rice, we give it to them and go without. This is the African way. This is, you are so important that I will give you my last grain of rice. So Africa and socialism have the same in common at the ideological level. They dash where exploitation. Then we come to the political level. Now, when we are talking about the political level, to cut through the wall, what we're talking about is violence. Does the society operate peacefully on the one hand, or does it operate violently on the other? Is it a society where people care for each other, or is it a society where people kill each other? This is the bottom line. And the most potent tool for the managing of violence in any society is called the state. The state is a violence. That's what it is. Its job is to keep people in order. That is the purpose of the state. To keep the exploited in order. Now, in traditional African society, we were not exploiting each other. So we didn't even have states. We didn't need them. We didn't have prisons. We didn't need them because we're not exploiting. We didn't have old people's homes because we didn't dash away our old people. They were human, just like us. So the state didn't exist. And we see the beginnings of some states in African culture, but certainly not to the extent that they existed in Europe and some other parts of the world. But in the modern world, we see something different has arisen. We find that no nation in the modern world can exist without a state. That the violence in the world is now of such a magnitude that no one has the choice. You must have a state. And that state is not only for the violence within the nation. It is the state mechanism that protects a nation from violence from outside the nation. So you must have a state in order to defend yourself to protect yourself. So Africa must now have a state. And what it needs is not just jigsaw puzzle states. It needs a continental-wide, unified superstate. Why must it have a continental-wide superstate? To prevent the kind of things that we've been seeing, that people could just come in and invade a part of Africa called Libya, kill off the leader, and then just leave it in chaos. Or people from outside could just come into the Ivory Coast, the Côte d'Ivoire, just take the leader off in chains, and then again leave chaos in their wake. And whilst this is happening, other African people, not understanding that their continent, their nation is being invaded, are actually assisting the foreigners to come in and commit madness on our soil. So, socialism requires a state. If you don't have a state, it's not socialism. And if you don't have a united African state, you don't have Pan Afrikanism. If you don't have unity, which is what the continental-wide superstate represents, you do not have Pan Afrikanism, and African culture can be undermined by anybody outside and inside. And the fourth ingredient of scientific socialism is the economic component. And the dialectic there, so the dialectic in the politics was whether you have a state or you don't have a state. That's essentially it. And in the practical area of Africa, it's whether you have one state or you have lots of jigsaw puzzle states. And the one state is the solution. In the economic area, what you have is production. Do we have mass-producing factories in Africa, industrialization? Or don't we? Should Africa be pre-industrial, or should it be industrial? If it has all of those other ingredients in place, and it's pre-industrial, then that's a communal state. That's communalism. If you want to be socialist, you have to have the best and highest quality of production. This is essential to socialism. And you see, we don't have the luxury of not industrializing. It actually is not an option. Why is it not an option? Because what happens in the world is those nations that are industrialized can take advantage of those nations which are not industrialized. This is the essence of colonialism. Europe industrialized. We had not yet industrialized. They used their industrial capacity to come and subjugate us. And that's the essence of how colonialism came into being. It's part of the essence of how modern day neo-colonialism continues to exist. And what the capitalists do, is they deny our nations the opportunity to industrialize, because they recognize that if we are not industrialized, they have an advantage over us. They also recognize that when you take away the industrialization, when you take away the tools, and you come woman to woman or man to man, they recognize that they end up losing. If you put us in a boxing ring, they lose. If you put us on an athletics track, they lose. These are measurable sports. They lose in the physical arena against us. And it's their tools, their mastery of industrialization that allows them to win against us, even where on a one-to-one they find they cannot live at the same level of us. We must industrialize. And when Africa industrializes, Africa will become the most powerful nation on earth. So to summarize, socialism has four components. Philosophically, it is materialist. Ideologically, it is humanist. Politically, it must have a state. And economically, it must have industrialization. So those ingredients that I mentioned, the philosophical, the ideological, the political and economic, are fixed. Those are the fixed ingredients of scientific socialism. But there are also variable ingredients of scientific socialism. What are those variable ingredients? Well, we have to go back to the beginning. Because human beings are not all the same. Yes, we have characteristics which are the same, but we all have our individual differences. And our groups have their differences also. So African people have a different way of engaging with nature to Europeans, for instance. And so what happens is African people develop a different culture to Europeans, for instance. African people have a different history to Europeans, as an instance. And so it means that when those different histories, when those different cultures, when those different people interact with the four fixed ingredients, they must produce different results. It's impossible for them to produce the same results. So, let me give an example. In Africa, we have the Herero people in what today is called Namibia, but the Herero long precedes the term Namibia. If we go to the extreme northern hemisphere of the planet, there are the people who many of us will know as Eskimos. Now, I want you to imagine that they've both been set a task. We don't have to imagine it, it's happened in history. That they must build shelter, they must build houses for them to live in. Now, when the Eskimo builds their house, they search their environment, and what do they find? They find snow. And so they take the snow. They make bricks out of the snow. They build those bricks into a structure which protects them from the cold elements. They can go inside. We call it an igloo. Now, the Herero people, solving the same problem of shelter, they look in their environment. They don't see snow. They see mud. They see branches, twigs, etc. They build a hut. The hut protects them from the hot sun in the middle of the day if they need that protection. But the result is that the Eskimo is building a house, the Herero is building a house. They both successfully built houses, but the two houses look nothing like each other. In fact, if the Herero probably doesn't even know what snow is traditionally, has no idea that there's a thing on the planet called snow. And even if the Herero found out that there's snow, and the Herero said, I like the way the Eskimos built their houses, and the Herero found some way of getting snow to Herero land, and then built an igloo in Herero land, it would have melted before it was complete. It's impossible for the Herero to build an igloo. Equally, it's impossible for the Eskimo to build a mud hut, because the snow is so thick, the ice is so thick on the ground, the Eskimo doesn't even come into contact with the earth in order to be able to build a hut. And even if they did come into contact with the ground, it's so densely frozen that they couldn't dig into the earth to take out the pieces that they would need. So both of them are solving the same problem, but their solutions to the problem have to be different. It's impossible for them to be the same. So it is when we build socialism. Socialism too has its variable factors. The snow is variable to the mud, etc. The mud and etc. So the people's history, the people's culture, and the people themselves are variable in different parts of the world. And so when they take the ingredients and when they bake their cake called socialism, it has to take account of their particular history. It has to take account of their particular culture. It has to take account of them as a particular people. In the same way that a shoe, a size 5 shoe, cannot fit an adult male, we cannot expect socialism from another part of the world to fit to be consistent with socialism. Well, consistent is not the right word, because they are consistent because of the high level ingredient, but it cannot be the same as the experience of socialism that will happen in the hot sun of Africa, with African people with their unique history and culture. So socialism is scientific for a number of reasons. It's scientific, firstly, because its philosophy demands that it must be scientific, and it demands of its practitioners that they must be scientific in their approach to life. It's also scientific because the higher level ingredients of socialism, the philosophy, ideology, politics, and economics, must be present in a particular form: materialism, humanism, state structure, and industrialization. That must be present for it to be socialism. So it's scientific in that those ingredients are the same. And thirdly, it is scientific because it must vary, and those variations are not by chance. They're not by accident. It must vary because the cultures vary. So all of the variations are explainable through a people, their history, and their culture. So there's a formula, much the same way as you would have in something like a break-even chart, where you have your fixed costs and you have your variable costs. So too in scientific socialism, the fixed element, the variable element, and the methodology determine its scientific character.